Welcome to Pair This With That, the podcast for everyday wine enthusiasts and amateur foodies who want to broaden their knowledge in a casual, conversational forum. In just about 30 minutes each episode, we'll help you become that friend people go to when they want to know what wine to have with dinner or how to pick out the right bottle at the local wine shop. You don't have to be a sommelier or a chef. You just need a healthy curiosity. Join us as we expand our food and wine knowledge together. And now, here's your host, John Reed.
And there we are. Welcome back. This is the Pair This With That podcast. I'm John. I'm your host. And today we're going to talk about an important event in the world of wine, particularly United States wine. I'm recording this after the actual anniversary, so I know this is going to come out. This will be a little belated. But you know, I wanted to record it on the day of, or maybe the day before, but just things just kept coming up. You know, it was partly my procrastination, but it was also, you know, prepping for the Memorial Day weekend that was coming up. I had to drive my wife to the airport. And you know, then I had to cook a lot of food for Memorial Day weekend. And you know, I'm not going to sit here and let you judge me. You know, I record the episodes when I record the episodes, and I'm not going to stick to your schedule. Just kidding. But, you know, regardless, this is going to come out after the anniversary of the actual event, which is the 47th anniversary of the Judgment of Paris. Now, you might already know about this very historic event in wine, but I wanted to devote an episode to this just in case you weren't, in case you may have heard about it but didn't know too much about it. I thought this is an event in the wine world that really deserves some devotion to conversation, to a dialogue, to talking about it. So this is pretty much what put California wine on the global wine map. It's what gave winemakers in Northern California almost overnight respect in the world of wine, which until then had pretty much been dominated by winemakers in Europe. Now, this event was originally called the Paris Wine Tasting of 1976, and we'll get into a little bit of why it later became called the Judgment of Paris, but it was organized by a man named Steven Spurrier. Now, who is Steven Spurrier? Steven Spurrier was an Englishman. He was born in Cambridge, England, and he grew up in the wine business. His parents owned a wine shop where he gained early exposure to that world. And after completing his formal education, Spurrier began working in the wine trade, first in London, and then he moved on to Paris. And in 1970, he opened a wine shop called Le Cave de la Madeleine in the heart of Paris. And this was located near the famous Madeleine Church. Now, the shop quickly, even though it was owned by an Englishman, it quickly gained popularity and became a hub for many wine enthusiasts and professionals in the city. And alongside running a shop, Spurrier organized wine tastings and educational events to further establish himself as a knowledgeable and respected figure in the wine community. Now, at the time, French wines were considered the pinnacle of quality and were highly regarded by experts and consumers around the world as the best wine you could possibly get. If you had a bottle of French wine, you were drinking the best wine. And that's what everybody just knew at that time. But as an entrepreneur, Spurrier wanted the mission of his shop to go beyond just French wines, and he wanted to introduce people, his customers, to wines from other regions in the world. So Spurrier, of course, you know, wasn't French, loved French wine, but thought his shop and his educational events should broaden the horizons of people who came there beyond just French wine. So this tasting event was in 1976, and it was just before, about 2 months before July 4th. And, you know, the United States was just about to celebrate its bicentennial. So it was 1976, 200 years after the American Revolution. And Spurrier thought this would be a great opportunity to have an event that featured wines from America. And he had heard that, there was a lot of serious attempts at winemaking going on in the Napa Valley in Northern California in general. So he looked to find some wines there and bring some that he thought were the best that could go up against some of the best wines made in France. So California, again, was growing, but nobody really took them seriously. And they surely thought there was no way that these farmers in Northern California could make wine that could compare to the French wine. But Spurrier thought a blind tasting event featuring French versus California wines would get a lot of notoriety, and again, would be the perfect event to celebrate the bicentennial of the United States. Now, when he arranged this, he established the event and it would feature 9 judges who were regarded as some of the finest and most knowledgeable figures in the world of wine. Now, I won't go into the names because I just trip all over myself trying to pronounce them, but he had 2 French winery owners, the head of the National Institute of Appellations of Origin. He had, I believe, 2 wine writers, as well as a chef and 3 restaurateurs. I believe one of them was a sommelier. And for the event, he split the event into 2 judging, categories. There was whites and there was reds. So there were 10 wines competing in each category. So 5 French and 5 California, both categories, white and reds. On the French side, the white wine category included some renowned Burgundian producers, such as Domaine Rolot, Domaine Lefebvre. I'm going to butcher these names, I'm sorry. While the red wine category featured some of the Bordeaux's most esteemed winemakers, including Chateau Mouton Rothschild and Chateau Haut-Brion, among others. These wines, the wines that were in the tasting, were graded on a 20-point scale. Each judge independently tasted and scored the wines based on their own assessments. The 20-point scale is a common scoring system in wine competitions and tastings. Now, again, this was a blind event, meaning that what the judges were drinking, they could smell, they could see, they could sniff, they could taste, but all they knew is there was a white wine in front of them or there was a red wine in front of them. They didn't know what kind of wine it was, and they didn't know from what region it came. So they did not know whether the wine they were drinking when it was the white portion of the event, if that was a French wine or if that was a California wine. So it was completely unknown to them exactly what they were drinking. So there could be really no prejudice. Obviously, they favored French wines and had a not so great opinion on California wines, but given this format, there was no way they could express a bias in what they were tasting. So the judges assigned points to each of the wines based on various factors such as appearance, aroma, flavor, complexity, balance, and overall quality. Now, the higher scores indicated the better quality wines, and the total points were tallied to determine the rankings. Now, as you can assume from my introduction to this episode, the American wines won. And this was pretty shocking because they not only won, they won both categories. They won both white and red. And of course, everybody was flabbergasted because this just doesn't happen. If you're putting wines from California up against French, obviously people are going to think that the French ones are better, you blind tasting or not, but that's not what happened. So this is really what shook the wine world to its core. The French were the king of the mountain, the wine mountain, and they were just knocked off by these upstarts from Napa Valley and Northern California. So the two wines that won. First, let's talk about the white category. The first one was the 1973 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay. Now, this wine was produced by Chateau Montelena, which is located in the Napa Valley, and it was crafted by a winemaker named Mijenko Mike Grgich. He eventually went on to start his own wine label, Grgich Hills. I've visited the Napa region, and I've been to both the Grgich Hills and Chateau Montelena tasting room. And so if you ever go there, I definitely recommend visiting those two sites, because you're really looking at history, especially, as it relates to the Judgment of Paris in 1976. The Chardonnay, the 73 Chardonnay that won this category, stood out with a rich and complex offering of flavors, balanced acidity, and exceptional aging potential. And its victory in the tasting brought international recognition to California's Chardonnay production. Now, the red category was taken by Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cabernet Sauvignon. This is also a 1973 vintage, and Stag's Leap is also located in the Napa Valley. It's funny because we also visited that winery, but we didn't actually get to go in. We pulled up and we found out that you had to have an appointment to do a tasting and take a tour of the facility. So they told me and my wife that we were welcome to walk along the property and even in the vineyards, but that we should watch out because there were rattlesnakes in there. So we didn't spend too much time there. If we couldn't get in and taste the wine or take a tour, rattlesnakes weren't going to sell us on the deal. So this Cabernet Sauvignon was crafted by winemaker Warren, I'm going to butcher this, Winiarski. Yeah, that's it, Winiarski. The wine impressed the judges with an elegant structure, ripe fruit flavors, and remarkable balance. And, this also, like Chateau Montelena Chardonnay did for California Chardonnay, this really brought respectability and notoriety to California Cab Savs. So the event happened. Obviously, it's over. Everybody's just shocked at the result. So, Steven Spurrier had to stay in Paris. So how did this affect him? So the reaction, the aftermath was kind of mixed. He did continue a very long and distinguished career in the wine industry up until his death in 2021. But obviously, the outcome of the Judgment of Paris tasting put into question a long-standing reign of French wines, and those in that community were none too happy about it. The French wine establishment initially reacted with skepticism and divisiveness toward the results, considering it a fluke or an aberration, or somehow, I don't know, like the way the wines were presented was meant to skew it into the California wines. So he faced some criticism and some pushback from the French wine producers and industry figures who questioned the credibility of the tasting. They argued that the French judges had been misled, or that the competition was not a fair representation of quality French wines. Now, we talked about the reason for the name change from the Paris wine tasting of 1976 to the Judgment of Paris, and the reason that it was called, we now know it as the Judgment of Paris, is because it got a lot of press. It got some press in Time magazine, and there was a book called The Judgment of Paris by a writer named George Tabor. So this is kind of how the event became known, just because I think that the judgment, so to speak, was so skewed toward toward the United States wines that, it had to take on a new name. It couldn't just be called the Paris wine tasting anymore. There had to be some kind of significance to the fact that the judgment was for the American wines, for the California wines. So, this only added to kind of like the tension between, Spurrier and the French wine industry. Eventually they kind of got over it, but it did take some time. He was kind of somewhat of a pariah in the wine world after that. So, obviously, these people had a legacy, and they didn't like their legacy stepped on by a bunch of, again, these upstart farmers from Northern California who they figured were just trying to mimic what was going on in France, but never could because of the terroir, because of the knowledge, because of the lack of experience in winemaking compared to France. The tradition, California wines couldn't possibly match up to French wines. So there was a little friction in the industry overall, but overall, I mean, the outcome eventually had a positive impact on Steven Spurrier's career, helping to establish him as a very prominent figure in the international wine community. So it's interesting to note that he did hold in 2006 a 30th anniversary event of the Judgment of Paris and arranged another French versus California wine tasting event. It wasn't exactly the same. It wasn't like a totally blind tasting because the judges knew exactly the wines they were tasting. They didn't have the bottles in front of them, but they knew, they had a rundown of what was going to be presented to them. And so they judged based on all the criteria, the quality and everything. And the California wines won again. So obviously California did something right in 1976, and they kept on doing something right up until that 30th anniversary event. So I think that's pretty much, this is going to be a shorter episode, but I think this is pretty much all I can talk about right now with regard to this. If you want to learn more or get a more of a flavor for this event, there's the book, again, The Judgment of Paris by George Tabor. I've listened to the audiobook. It's been a long time, but that is a very detailed account of not only the event itself, but the Chateau Montelena, the winemakers, their history, and what led them to appear in that tasting, and as well as this Stag's Leap wine family and what led them to the event. Now, there are also two movies. One is devoted to this. It's called Bottle Shock. Now, I do want to warn you, if you haven't seen this movie, that it is generally the way it happened, but there's a lot of poetic licensing. Like I recommend you read the book first and then watch the movie, because you'll see how much was added to the story. It's, all the characters are real, but how it all went down is not what you find as far as what the book accounts, how the book accounts for the event. So take it with a grain of salt. Now, I happen to like the movie. I watch it a few times a year, I got to say, because it's just an enjoyable movie. So I definitely recommend you watch it. However, again, go in with that knowing that it's not an accurate description of how the event took place. The other movie, I don't know if you're familiar with the Somm film series. That's SOMM, short for sommelier. It's by Jason. The movies are directed by Jason Wise, and he's very connected to the wine industry in California. And he's made 3 films that are devoted to wine. And Somm 3 is looks back on the Judgment of Paris and how monumental of an event it was, and sort of tries to recreate that and it features in it Stephen Spurrier, before he died, obviously, and Jancis Robinson. I'm not good with names today, who is also very well known in the wine industry. There's also an American sommelier in there. His name I'm totally blanking on right now, but basically they talk about the Judgment of Paris, and they try to not recreate the event itself, but sort of pay tribute to it by allowing these judges to taste these wines that were handpicked by sommeliers as far as their balance, complexity, flavor, aromas, and they get at the end of the film, they get the judges to try these wines and give their thoughts on them. And so it's really just a tribute to the kind of knowledge and experience and just devotion to quality wine that brought California to prominence with the Judgment of Paris in 1976. So I think before I butcher any more names, I'm going to wrap this up. Again, sorry for the shorter episode, but if you haven't read or seen any of these movies, I definitely recommend, because if you want to know more about wine, this is definitely an event you should know about. And I think that's it. And thank you for joining me again. Be sure to tune in for the next episode. Cheers.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Pair This with That. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, cheers.